Once again, let's take a look at Romans chapter 8, verses 14 through 17, as we continue our devotional study in the book of Romans in chapter 8. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. Well, as we saw in our last devotional, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ who's been born again, regenerated by the Spirit of God, because you trusted in the saving work of Christ and Christ alone on the cross of Calvary, you are a son of God. And as sons, we have the full privileges and inheritance of the Father. That's what the word huios meant, as we discussed last time. Sons come of age. In other words, we have the full inheritance of the Father. But as we continue our study, we see that Paul goes on to share that we are also no longer in bondage. Note again, verse 15, for you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. So what is Paul talking about when he talks about that we are no longer under bondage? Well, first of all, we are no longer under the bondage of works or religious performance. Galatians chapter 2, verse 4. And this occurred because of false brethren secretly brought in, who came in by stealth to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage. And here the Apostle Paul was speaking of the Judaizers that had come into the church and said, well, it's great that you've trusted Christ, but now what you need to do is keep all of the religious feasts and all of the other obligations of Judaism. And as we also read again in verse 9, but now after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? And so here the Apostle Paul says that these religious performances or obligations are the beggarly things. They are the beggarly elements that will bring us once again into bondage. And then, of course, there is also the bondage of the spirit of this world. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 12. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit whom is from God, that we might know the things that we have been freely given to us by God. Or Galatians chapter 4, verse 3. Even so we, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. And then there is also the bondage of fear that I think the Apostle Paul in our text is directly speaking to. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Or 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. And that also, there is that fear or that bondage of death. Not just physical death, which is a result of sin, but spiritual death as well. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 15. And released those who through fear of death were all their lives subject to bondage. And this bondage, this fear, is a bondage that is caused by the corruption of sin. Romans chapter 8, verse 21. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. What Paul is speaking about there is that because of sin, the whole of creation is in corruption. All things die. All things devolve into entropy and become corrupted. Or 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 19. While they promised them liberty, they themselves are servants of corruption. For of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he brought into bondage. And ultimately, what we're really talking about here is the bondage of sin. And Jesus spoke directly to that very thing in John chapter 8 and verse 34. And Jesus answered them, most assuredly, I say to you, whoever commits sin is the slave of sin. And so, the Apostle Paul here in our text is talking about the fact that we could be under then this kind of bondage, as we read in verse 15. For you did not receive that spirit of bondage, again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. So that we have not received the spirit of bondage, but rather the spirit of adoption, as we read in the latter part of the verse. But you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. Galatians chapter 4, verse 5 speaks to that as well. To redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. In other words, we are adopted into the family of God, of which Paul had been speaking about in verse 14, where he talks about the fact that we are the huios, as sons come of age. We have received then the spirit of adult sonship, whereby we cry out, Abba, Father. And what that means is that this is a term of familiarity, a term of an intimate relationship where we cry out, Abba, Father, or my daddy. The word Abba is the informal Aramaic term for father. And this connotes an intimacy or tenderness or dependence and a complete lack of anxiety and fear. And when you and I were saved, our old life of sin was completely canceled in God's eye, thereby eliminating that fear. And we have, therefore, no reason then to fear sin and death, because it is Christ who conquered those two evils, those two enemies on our behalf. And it is in Him we are given a new and divine nature and become true children of God, with all of the attendant blessings that Paul is speaking about here, all of the privileges and all of the inheritance, as we are going to delve into as we get to verse 17 in the next devotional. And until we see the Lord face to face, His own Spirit then will be a ceaseless witness to the authenticity of our adoption into the family of God. And we see that in verse 16. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. Now, the Apostle Paul here is not speaking of some sort of mystical small voice whereby the Spirit is letting us know that we are in the Beloved or that we're saved. But rather, I think he might be referring to the fruit of the Spirit of Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, which the Spirit produces in us as believers. Thereby, we are assured of the working of the Spirit of God in our lives. I'd like to leave you with one last verse that speaks to that very issue. It's found in 1 John chapter 3, verses 18 through 20. My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed, in truth. And by this we know that we are of the truth and shall assure our hearts before Him. For if our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our heart and knows all things. The Spirit of God assures our hearts as He produces the fruit of the Spirit in our lives.